All right, here's the first lesson of Unit 12. It's going to be a short one, the 70s, stalemated 70s, lots of economic trouble and expanded foreign policy issues in the Middle East. Here we go. Here is Mr. Nixon on the way. Well, we've been there before already, right? We covered him in the Vietnam War, but let's talk about Nixon at home here a little bit more. Domestic policy, Republican, conservative, laissez-faire, smaller government, right? Still kind of in that vital center kind of a mindset here. He starts out, he's actually maybe a little more progressive than Republicans in the past. He pushed to and support the expansion of Social Security. He talked about a guaranteed income for people. We'll talk about that in a second here coming up. Increased funds for public housing, dealing with the deterioration of inner cities, an expanded Job Corps program that was part of the Great Society, increased funds for Medicare and Medicaid. Of course, there's a large population out there that likes that, and that would generate votes as well, keeping you in office. But he talked about and proposed a family assistance plan that guaranteed a minimum income of $1,600 per family. It dies in a conservative Senate, but again, a progressively Republican type Nixon here with all this. And this is also connected to foreign policy also, but the United States is really going to be removed from the gold standard forever and permanently to the present day because of his decision in response to the OPEC oil embargo, which is huge for us to understand here. Now, we are essentially not connecting paper money to any hard specie currency, gold, at all. That allows you to print a lot more of it because gold is scarce. Paper is not. Richard Nixon, civil rights, does expand affirmative action that was started by Lyndon Johnson. Requirements for minorities in federal jobs in particular is what he pushed and did champion, although he is going to resist and want to slow down. He's kind of a gradualism, kind of a mindset politician here where he wants to slow down busing of students, slow down integration. There was forced busing that was creating a lot of tension amongst people and causing some very long bus rides for families of both colors and minority and majority status. Title IX is important here as well. It'll be one of your top 5 terms. It's passed here as a piece of federal legislation guaranteeing that discrimination according to sports does not occur, and it will vastly expand women's sporting opportunities in high schools and colleges immensely to the present day. Before this, most of what was around, not entirely. There was some basketball, there was some sports in a few instances in a few places around the country, but not a lot at all. And the quality and the equality of facilities and money allocated was not the same. That comes into existence and puts things more on par here in the 1970s. Otherwise, it was cheerleading might have been the most consistent. In other clubs would be the things that girls were having access to. There's a lot of a green movement going on here in the 1960s, right? There's a movement to fix everything in the 60s and the 70s. And the environment is a key part of that as well. Earth Day is established on April 22nd, 1970. There are regulations here. Again, not something necessarily laissez-faire kind of Republican would necessarily support, but there's a clean air that's passed with clean air standards. It was really becoming noticeable that the country was very, very well abused by business and industry over the decades. There's an Occupational Safety and Health Administration that's created, also known as OSHA, to make sure that, well, for example, people have hard hats on a construction job and that there are safety lines and safety this and safety that so people don't get injured on the job. And that there is actually even, for example, enough air running through our buildings in our school, for example, and quality air. That's probably something OSHA is dealing with the COVID outbreak here in recent months. The Environmental Protection Agency is established to monitor and put rules and regulations on the use of our environment and control pollution. There's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, that's created. If you drive down toward Key Biscayne, you'll pass an office there. A lot of big changes here happening. But let's get back to foreign policy. Foreign policy and how it relates to where we've been, which is Vietnam, that is détente. Détente is basically the phrase that means improved relationship or an improved relationship between two sides, in this case between the United States, Soviet Union, and China. That was his goal. He wanted to improve the connection. And remember, he's the big communist hunter in that House committee from back in the 1940s, the Alger Hiss trials and things like that, hunting for communists. He's also the guy that traveled to Russia and met with Khrushchev and had the kitchen debates, things of that nature. He was known to be hard on communism, but he wants an improved relationship with the Soviet Union and China. And, of course, we've gone through that Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's one of the motivating pieces to this as well. He's going to, though, play the Soviet Union and China against one another. They're both communist systems, but they practice different types of communism, and there's a long-standing conflict between them over the centuries in terms of borders and just not necessarily on even terms with one another. So they're not allies. Do not think that they're necessarily allies. So we're going to try, or he is going to try and place them at odds against one another to get them to help push for an end to Vietnam. And he's going to plan some summit meetings. So this is kind of the scenario where, well, you know, if you have two friends of yours that all of a sudden are fighting, and maybe one starts putting pressure on you to support them in the fight, and then so does the other. He kind of takes the initiative here and instead starts to really try to make sure that one side is getting a feeling that I am on their side more than another, and because of that, maybe it creates some animosity, but maybe it also brings some negotiation and some fixes to the conflict at hand. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, is going to travel to both sides, and since we have never really had communications with China since they became communist in 1949, that's different. And the Soviets are going to take notice of that. I wonder why they're talking, those Americans, to the Chinese. That makes us kind of suspicious. And Nixon and the United States is going to say they're going to realize that's going to be a response. And they're going to say, well, no, maybe we can pressure the Soviets to help us in what we would like to see happen in terms of foreign policy and help us get this Vietnam thing ended and over. A part of this detente is something called realpolitik. And split the term there. Get real, man, if you've ever heard of that phrase. That's not reality. That's not going to work. Ideology versus reality. What is where Nixon is at, and so is Henry Kissinger. We would like ideally for communism to be gone, but it's not realistic to try and be too forceful and aggressive with communism because it could result in another war. It is what it is, right? And so you can't deny what is, and we're going to work with what is, maybe even though it's a little bit unsavory, we're going to work with what is, or maybe we work with governments and leaders in the world that are perhaps not necessarily very democratic, but they're not communist either. We're going to use that to our advantage to try and attain our goals. And all of this is really about trying to make sure that there's a balance of power in the world. You know, the TR's treaty in Portsmouth between the Russians and the Japanese, and the pre-World War I alliance system that had been established in Europe for decades prior to World War I. That's what he really wants in the world, is more of a balance of power so that one doesn't become too powerful or to maybe even weaken the Soviet Union by playing the Chinese off against them. And this kind of comes about in a weird event. And we're going to have you watch the clip, and it's called Ping Pong Diplomacy. And there it literally involves ping pong. This visit comes about with this event of ping pong happening, right? It was an open door for Nixon. This United States team traveling to China to try and play ping pong, invited by the Chinese. It was taken as an invitation to, maybe those Americans would like to talk to us politically more often as well. Let's just go ahead and start by testing the waters and invite the ping pong team over. And so there is a major change here in which Nixon is remembered heavily for being the first American president to go to China and to meet Mao and to talk and start supporting the notion that we're going to help them get back into the United Nations which they were kicked out of when they became communist in 1949. There's going to be economic and cultural exchanges, things of that nature. This whole thing is kind of played out in the Forrest Gump movie, which is why I have Tom Hanks there in the middle if you want to check that out. But notice the picture here. He's at the Great Wall. His wife is wearing red, right? That's kind of a symbolic kind of gesture to the Chinese. And all of a sudden we have a relationship. We have diplomatic relations and discussions with the Chinese. And the Soviet Union takes note of this, and this helps bring about negotiations in other areas because they're worried about how close we're getting to the Chinese and what deals we're making with them because the Soviets aren't necessarily totally allies either. And so in 1979, that will actually happen. China will be officially recognized by the United States under the Democrat Jimmy Carter, which is going to get a lot of criticism. And Nixon got some criticism here, right? Not hardcore enough on communism? Mr. Nixon, maybe you're getting a little soft with the communists. You're talking to them, you're generating a relationship with them. What's going on here? Might be a little familiar, although it's a little different here with Obama, Democrat, and opening up to Cuba here while he was in office. That would fill in that blank. Some of the things that start to happen or were happening leading up to Detente. Well, in 1967, President Johnson had called for, in terms of now nuclear powers and nuclear issues, called for arms limitation talks with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been gaining significantly in anti-ballistic missiles, missiles that shoot down other missiles, and that kind of thing as a defense system. It seemed to be ahead on that. And this was our effort to try and maybe shut that down so that they didn't get an advantage on us in a military situation, which could bring about perhaps them attacking first, knowing that we couldn't do anything about it, and they could just shoot down our missiles. So the USSR, though, in fear it intensified arms race and a U.S.-backed China and using China as an ally against them, and that kind of spurs some talks and discussion. The Soviet Union premiered after Khrushchev is a guy named Brezhnev, and they'll start talking about the reduction of nuclear weapons more often. And that is a significant thing that you're going to read about here in a little bit. Keep in mind, now, again, this détente is something that did help bring about the end of the Vietnam War. Not only the increased bombing and the heavy fighting going on over there, but he does try to establish, does get the Chinese and the Chinese a little bit of help since they're a neighbor in getting that to happen, right? And so with these two powers involved, the escalation that had started with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and combined with Vietnamization, Nixon is able to bring troop levels down, and eventually, though very slow, tens of thousands more Americans die, and the bombing does increase, and more Vietnamese and other people die, but it does help. It is a part of the end of the Vietnam War. Realpolitik and détente in bringing the other side in a little bit more. So success there for that is generally the consensus. In 1969, Nixon starts conducting some discussions with the Soviets. There's Brezhnev there, called the SALT I Treaty talks. And that stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. We signed an ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, in 1972. And this kind of comes about because, as you can see in that particular picture there, we're in a time period where they're making missiles that they just don't have one nuclear warhead, but they have several nuclear warheads at the top of that missile. And at some point it spits out multiple nuclear warheads, and they land in multiple different places. How do you shoot all of that down? Right? But yet the arms race does continue in other ways, and they're always looking for an advantage somehow, someway. The evaluation of détente is that there's good things. It does improve relations here in the Nixon administration, the Soviet-Chinese situation does help bring about the end of Vietnam. But the relationship will decline when we get into the mid-70s. The arms race never really goes away. There is some agreements on nuclear weapons, but it's going to totally blow up in 1979. That'll be our next lesson, lesson 2, with the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. It goes very much south. The economy is the other important thing we need to know about the 1970s and a characteristic of the 1970s, and that is characterized by something called stagflation. It's a double whammy, double negative. There is declining economic growth, and there's increasing prices at the same time. Unemployment going up and the prices of everything going down. Notice the guy getting stretched in two directions there. This is an unusual situation, and it has come about because of several factors that we're going to cover here now. And multiple administrations, Nixon and Carter coming up, are going to have a hard time really figuring out how to deal with it and have a lot of troubles with it. His economic ideals are to control inflation and limit the money supply, but of course when we'll see that Nixon gets rid of the gold standard, that the money supply is going to go up, but that doesn't do much good for the economy. There's going to be a freeze in federal wages and price controls. This is something that's going to result in some pushback by Congress. Congress says spend the money, but then Nixon says, no, I don't want to spend it. And so that's seen as a conflict of interest, and some would argue even unconstitutional. Maybe a little bit more on that later. But he's doing this to try to control inflation. So we have unemployment increasing and inflation increasing. Very bad combination of things. Why? Huge deficits in Vietnam and the Great Society programs in the 1960s were a major cause of it. There's a lot of money floating around, and because of that, and debts to pay, there are increased taxes, and because there's increased taxes, also though people cannot necessarily buy the things they usually buy, unemployment rises to about 6%. There is a gross domestic product that changes here, right? The amount of and the value of all consumed goods and services that are produced in a single year is really declining, which also is going to lead us to the significant amount of things that are not being sold overseas. We enter into the 1970s for the first time a trade deficit. This is something that is around here yet today. If you listen to the news at all, example, China imports more to the United States than we export to them, right? And a trade deficit is not necessarily something that's a great thing, right? We are essentially, the idea is that our money is going more toward overseas countries, and they're taking up in the stuff that they sell to us, as opposed to us getting their money in the things we sell to them, right? And so this is a significant deal and a trend that continues into the present day. Again, inflation is soaring. I remember my parents talking about this. They're very young farmers at about this point in time. In terms of interest rates, the interest rates for a loan for a car or for a home were immensely high. Those are interest rates you would see on a credit card, perhaps today, which is really bad. Do some simple math there. 20% of what $100 is tacked onto your monthly payment of whatever amount. And quite often my parents were not able to make anything other than the interest payments. They never paid off the actual loan for years and years at a time. International competition is another factor. Germany has been rebuilt. Japan has been rebuilt after the war, and they're very much becoming very techy and very industrially driven, and had been before. But lots of the new tech, TVs, electronics, and things like that, especially from the Japanese side. So there's more competition from overseas countries like that, but there's also increased job competition in the country. The ERA movement and women and teens are working more than ever before. Girls, women are not getting married as early as they had been before either. And so they're getting into the workforce, they're supporting themselves. There's a little bit of an offshoot effect of this in the experience of World War II, right? I can make my own kind of a money kind of a thing. The industrial heartland of America, and we hear about this in elections a lot, is really falling apart and seeing increased competition from overseas. It hasn't modernized. It hasn't kept up with the new technologies. It hasn't kept up with and been able to keep up with the cheaper labor and the fewer restrictions that other countries have on industry that makes their products cheaper. The shift in our economy is one from less about manufacturing and more to services like restaurants and hotels and things of that nature. And our industrial heartland, where the big steel, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers are, the auto industry is becoming known as the Rust Belt. And again, competition from foreign countries is a major factor in that. So on top of all of that, there is this international crisis surrounding oil, and it's the energy crisis of 1973. It is the number one major cause that you need to remember, know, and understand about the economic turmoil of the 1970s, which is the worst since the Great Depression, right? The affluence is gone from the 50s and the 60s. And so this is the major cause. And so it's centered around the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The Arab nations, linguistic group, countries that speak Arab in the region, have formed an organization called OPEC. And they're bitter toward Western nations' support of Israel. Right, and that conflict in Israel. In 1967, there was a 6-day war in which Israel was attacked by pretty much all of the Arab countries around them, and Israel basically won that and the territory you see there next to Egypt, which is the Sinai Peninsula, and they won the West Bank, so on and so forth. All right, so we have the 6-day war resulting in Israel taking over significant amounts of territory in the Middle East and that region of the West Bank, which today is still a major point of contention. They really haven't given up much of that. They've actually been settling good portions of that kind of thing. That's the issue here at this point in time. So this event is bringing about a bit of a revenge factor in 1973. Again, OPEC is this organization of oil-producing states. They get together, they meet, they talk about establishing how much oil we're going to produce in a particular year to control the supply, and then also the prices that they're going to generally set. And that has a great impact on the rest of the world, the economies, the standard of living of the rest of the world. And they know that they have a significant amount of pull with that oil in world politics. And so that's what they're doing here. They basically are going to invade, again, Israel to try and take back land and territory. And they are going to also establish a oil embargo in this scenario to put pressure on the West, because in the United States, primarily the number one supporter of Israel, to stop supporting Israel and to get what they would like to see happen in the Middle East, essentially get rid of Israel. Egypt and Syria really are the key driving attackers here in all of this, in attacking and waging war in the Sinai Peninsula. The Soviet Union is supplying all of these nations in this region with military weapons and such. They're essentially a little bit more on the Soviet side of the world, which is why the United States is also very much concerned not only in oil, but influence of communism and access and control of the communist world over this oil. Nixon orders a massive airlift of supplies to Israel, some $2 billion worth to something like that kind of a degree. And there are threats of an escalation moving maybe more toward nuclear war. There was a really super high alert placed on the United States military at this point in time. The United States and Soviet Union proposed to make a proposal to the Soviet Union to make a ceasefire, and that ends essentially in the Israelis winning in this particular war here again. And negotiating that to happen happens with the Secretary of State, who's very well known and still alive yet to this day as of this recording, Henry Kissinger, which got the withdrawal of the Arabs and lifted the embargo. Whatever the details are, not that important for us, but this is about the point in time where the oil and the influence or the lack of gas really impacted people on a small scale, common, average, everyday people. And you're going to see that, well, you might be familiar, in the 50s, especially the 60s, the muscle cars were a big thing, and cars just in general guzzled a lot of gas. All of a sudden, people started giving up those big 8-cylinder engines, moving to 6-cylinder engines and even 4-cylinder engines, and look at the companies from Asia that start to gain a foothold in the car market in the United States and the world. They bring in the little economy cars. This is the event that helps trigger that shift to the smaller economy, fuel-efficient car. And so our oil prices are hugely impacted by this. Notice right here in 1973, the price of oil just shoots straight up. Big impact in the economy. It's one of the reasons why the economy was so especially successful in the 50s and 60s, and that oil was really super cheap. But now it's going in a completely different direction. And we're going to get into our next lesson here where there's another event that drives it up even higher, making the 1970s an incredibly difficult time economically, as opposed to on top of all the other things going on for people in the United States, and particularly in other parts of the world too, with all of this going on as well. Again, the worst economy since the Great Depression. Notice the shift also to other forms of fuel that you see starting to happen here also. in this time period, right? The 1970s, 1980s, nuclear power starts to pop up. Hydropower was around long before that, but nuclear and renewables into our present future being driven by this. I'm going to have you watch a short video on the conflict in the Middle East and a review of this in more detail. Covers the situation with the gold standard being taken away and how that was used as a tool to combat the embargo and to be a tool to work against OPEC. But in prelude to that also, I'll have you watch also a little video clip on Watergate to review that particular situation. All of this is linked to, and the Watergate scandal is linked also to the investigation about what was going on with the Pentagon Papers. Nixon and his staff recruited a team of ex-CIA and FBI operatives who become known as the plumbers, and their job is to stop the leaks of information out of the Pentagon, find out who did it, and he wants to punish them. And these particular plumbers will be utilized, and some of these particular individuals will be utilized to also find out information on the Democratic Party in the election of 1972. Going to have three people running here. George McGovern, a Democrat, says, get the heck out of Vietnam. All over it, no more of that. George Walsh is going to say we're going to win in Vietnam, we're going to bomb in the Stone Age, but he's also, of course, that segregationist. He's shot during that campaign and paralyzed. He kind of has, as a segregationist, an epiphany moment, and he is sorry for his actions in supporting segregation and such. And of course, Nixon and Spiro Agnew are going to run for election, and they are going to argue that peace is at hand. Hang on with me. We're almost there in Vietnam, and it works. But then after the election is done, the scandal starts to leak out about Watergate, and I'll let you discover more about that later. Have a good day. Keep making the hay. Check out the home learning for your left side.